Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Zoom into Wine. It's time for the show and your host, Ian Blackburn.
Make sure you can hear me okay, is that right?
I can.
Oh, good. Everybody else, there's their nodding in the background. Thumbs up, one thumb up, one. Okay, good. So,
glasses up. We got a toast.
Yeah, really, mine is empty. So, there's something wrong with the glass. It's
Mark,
a
that's not a good
delicious glass. But I absolutely have a little bit of the end of the dregs of the day in the tasting room, and I'm gonna have a little Temperance Hill because
it's like the shoemaker's daughter, right?
Yeah. What? Shoes for me? Are you kidding? So, I guess we should talk a little bit about.
Are we starting with the Temperance Hill one?
Yeah,
I think we should. That sounds like a great idea.
Yeah, let's talk about Let's go for it.
Yeah. So, well, you should have some of this wine. I assume you've got some wine. You should put some Temperance Hill in your glass, and you should smell it. And gee, it smells really good.
I always encourage people to cool their wines down. I got a little carried away. My wine's freaking cold as ice right now. I got to get it warmed up in the glass.
That's what palms are for.
But
so what I'm trying to do here in Oregon, and I've been doing this for to start of my 32nd year, is to do something that's probably a bit more old world. And that is that I make wine primarily to eat with. That's my interest is food and wine. I grew up with wine and food. My father was a collector, started collecting when I was about 5, just discovered wine. Started drinking it with a good friend of his who had traveled in Europe. My mother, shortly thereafter, had an opportunity to study with a master chef from the Cordon Bleu. I grew up in Wisconsin, so it really wasn't a major hotbed of food and wine in the late 50s when I was young-ish. But starting in 59, my dad gave me a glass of wine and said, in Europe, children have wine with dinner. It's part of the celebration of a meal. It's not to get drunk, it's to enjoy and it's interesting. And he gave me a glass of wine and I smelled it and I tasted it and I said, what is this shit? This is terrible. And I looked over at him and I said, you're not drinking this. I want what you have. And he passed over the glass and I smelled it and I said, oh, I like this. And what he had given me was what he thought a kid who spent all of his money on sugar would like. He gave me some Mogan David and put that in my glass. And of course thought that was disgusting. And then he poured me probably some kind of a Puy Fouissé, some small producer Puy Fouissé. And I was like, I really like this. And that's what we did at night. My mother cooked beautifully. And she continued to study with this French master chef for 10 years, never to do commercial cooking, but just because she was really fascinated with food. And my father kept collecting and within a short period of time made a deal with an importer, and that person bought him an importer's license. And as a hobby, he flew off to France every year to buy wine for this Wisconsin importer and developed a large group of friends and brought in things from all over, even back in those days when things that are hot now weren't so hot. He was an early lover of Barolo and Chateauneuf du Pape, German Mosel Rieslings, even wines from Portugal. So I drank a lot of different things and loved wine, had a career, did that for a while, went back to school, had another career, had moved to Denver to do my graduate work, and then came to Oregon in a different job and started drinking Oregon wine in 1980, thinking that, there's wine here, there's people making wine. What I didn't realize until much later was that in 1980, David Lett, the first person to make Pinot Noir in Oregon, and from the 71 vintage, which wasn't released until 73, there was one Oregon Pinot Noir released in 1973, one. not 50 or 100 or 1,000, but one. And David Adelsheim in 1980, and David Adelsheim has obviously been around forever, right? David Adelsheim didn't release a Pinot Noir until 81. So this is pre-David Adelsheim when I started drinking these wines and was really fascinated. So bought them, visited wineries, did a lot of things, kind of really fell in love with the Oregon wine business. And in 83, read an article. At that point, I had some money. My wife, we were, two parents earning money with no children, was drinking a lot of champagne. An article came out in Bon Appetit where Andre Chelyshev, probably the most famous historic Napa Valley winemaker, was quoted as saying that the greatest sparkling wine in America would be made in Oregon, not California, because Oregon was the right place to grow the grapes of Champagne, Pinot Noir, and Chardonnay. And at that moment, I lost my mind. I was like, I'm going to do that. I'd never thought about making wine. But I was like, after that moment, that was the only thing I thought about. And so I spent 5 years trying to figure out how to do it because my dad didn't know how to make a bottle of wine. He knew a lot about drinking and knew about wines of the world. So I read a lot of books, took a lot of short courses at Davis, and then at a recommendation of a really preeminent person that worked in a wine laboratory at the time, went to work for the first Oregonian to make sparkling wine, who also just so happened to be the first Oregon winemaker to make vineyard-designated Pinot Noir from vineyards that he didn't own, because like most Oregon winemakers, he didn't have enough money to buy a vineyard and have a winery. There was a lot of vineyards that had no winery and a lot of people that own vineyards that had nothing to do with making wine and having to go out and do the kind of thing I'm doing now. And there were a lot of winemakers that just didn't have the bucks to do both. So back in those days, almost all of the wine that was made, more than 80%, was actually made from purchased fruit. And it turns out that, interestingly, all these years later, the greatest vineyards in Oregon, it turns out, were all originally vineyards that started without wineries. So I started a winery because I didn't have enough money for a vineyard, and started getting fruit from a friend of mine who just planted a vineyard and was just coming into production, and actually was practicing pediatrics at the time, and I was taking care of their kids. And that vineyard was Seven Springs Vineyard, which is probably, especially a decade and a half ago, was definitely the most famous vineyard in Oregon. I remember having a conversation with one of the longest reviewers for the Wine Advocate for Oregon, Pierre Rovani, and we were talking about how great Oregon vineyards were. And I said, I'm not sure there's anything beyond Premier Cru in Oregon. And he said, well, except for Seven Springs. And I had to agree with him. I've been making wine from that vineyard for a long time. But the other vineyards and there's still there's, the person that owns Seven Springs doesn't have a winery. He just leases the vineyard to people that do make wine at a location off the vineyard somewhere in a warehouse. So over the years, I've been fascinated with both sparkling wine, which I made for 13 years and then kind of quit, with Chardonnay that I made originally from 88 from Seven Springs Vineyard, and with Pinot Noir, which I started making 1 and then 2 and then 4 and then 6 and then 7, 8, depending on the vintage, and now which I have toned down to just 4, what I call the heritage vineyards. And these vineyards that I'm continuing to use, and the wines you're having today are 2 of those heritage vineyards. I've basically made since the vineyard was very early in its history, before anyone really knew what they were. Like, for example, Shea. When Shea was planted, Dick Shea lived in Connecticut. There was no winery there. Everyone told him it was a crazy place to buy a vineyard. It was the wrong soil. Everyone in those days thought that you had to be volcanic soil, like the Dundee Hills and the top of the Willamette Hills. That was where all the really great wines would come from. This was in the Yamhill Carlton district. It was very old sedimentary soil with sand underneath it. They were like, that's all wrong. The vines are going to drought out. You can't do that. But he planted it. And in 84, got first what was supposed to be a full crop. And at that point, I made a wine from a block that had gone to Panther Creek. And then when Ken Wright sold Panther Creek, I was asked to come in and make the wine. And the new owner said, so what about the Shea vineyard? You know, should we keep it? And I was like, there was 2 barrels that Ken had made from the baby fruit the year before. And I was like, yeah, you got to have this vineyard. So it ended up that we shared that 3-acre block. Each of us got half of it. It was a crop failure year. We only picked enough fruit to make 4 barrels. It's a very, very low yield. And the owner at Panther Creek sent the wine I had made off to Robert Parker. And Robert Parker gave the wine the highest score that he ever gave an Oregon Pinot Noir. 94 points, first 94-point wine. And then he stopped reviewing Oregon and gave it to Pierre Rovani, who then reviewed for the next decade. And the next time that there was a 94-point wine from Shea, I made that one. And, you know, that continues. The last 3 vintages of Shea have been 94-point wines from Venice, because Josh Reynolds is the person that's really been doing it longer. What's interesting to me is not scores and points, because I don't eat scores. They don't taste good to me. I don't drink them because they mean very little. But what is interesting to me is that site and the 2 sites you're having now, and then the other one, which is Freedom Hill, which are what I call the heritage vineyards, all make wines that are very distinct, that have a completeness when you just use grapes from those vineyards. A signature, what French would call terroir, what I like to call a sense of place. And the interesting thing in the United States is that, unlike in France, it's not on a map. So when you look at France, you look at Burgundy and you say, well, where are the great vineyards? It's, about 7% of them are Grand Cru in the Burgundy villages, and about 11% are Premier Cru. And essentially, most vineyards in Burgundy are no good to make as a single vineyard wine. It's only the really unusual, special places where you stand a chance to make something that really has that clarity to the sense of place. And so I believe that these 2 wines both have that, and the other vineyards that I continue to work with, I think it's very clear. I also enjoy the fact that it's very different, that they don't taste the same. And I would say to any of you that if you try these wines from different sites and you think that they taste alike, that's not clear what the difference is, then I failed you. You should go buy somebody else's wine, because I didn't deliver on what my promise to you was that you could taste this. You don't have to be a genius. You don't have to be a master sommelier. You don't have to be a connoisseur. You don't have to be anything. Just taste the wines. If they're not different, then I have not done my job. To that statement, they actually are made almost identically. Not exactly identically, because if I did everything exactly the same, I wouldn't be respecting the differences in these sites and the way the grapes mature and the balance of acid and tannin, fruit and other things. But to that end, they're made to reveal what's unique about them. So what's unique about Temperance Hill? Well, for me, there's the old Zenith. That's the old winery I had, not the new one, but that's an old one.
This one here?
I sold that back to my partners and walked away with enough money to buy 47.5 acres and build a new winery in the South Salem Hills. So most of what you see in that picture is actually an event center that my partners continue to run, except of course in the time of COVID, doing weddings for 300 people is not a particularly lucrative business. No. So they're kind of waiting. Yeah. And there is Oregon. And if you look at the Willamette Valley and you look at the entire state, you realize that the entire Willamette Valley is only about 4% of the landmass of Oregon. Wow. But if you look up in the top corner, the northwest corner of that big black thing that's there, that's actually where all the sub-appellations are. And in that now 1% of Oregon that's in the northwest corner, that's actually where 89% of Oregon Pinot Noir is made. And that's really the story of the Willamette Valley is Pinot Noir. In the other regions, it's warmer, drier, and you can grow other kinds of warmer climate grapes, Cab, Merlot, Syrah, Sangiovese, Tempranillo, lots of other things. You can get Sauvignon Blanc ripe, but in the Willamette Valley, especially in this northwest corner, it's really all about cool climate grapes. So Pinot Noir and its family, Pinot Blanc, which we make, Pinot Gris, which we made for 25 years, and then I just decided I needed to simplify my life and stopped. And Chardonnay, which started out as a kind of it was supposed to be a Burgundy-like climate, so you should be able to grow Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. But what happened was that the material that we got for the original plantings was all from California. And we got really good clones of Pinot Noir for Oregon. We got a really lousy clone of Chardonnay. And that was the one that almost everyone planted because it was widely available, was very successful in California, called the 108 clone. But it did not do well here. It needed a much hotter climate, so it was very well suited to the much warmer climates of California, both Russian River and Sonoma and Napa, Carneros, those kind of regions where just a lot more heat accumulated during the year. So thank God David Adelsheim, 25 years after we started planting this lousy Chardonnay, went to France and said, we need something better. And they were kind enough to give him something better. And after we brought that in and got it cleaned up so it was virus-free, we started planting in the 90s, mostly the late 90s, with very small blocks of Chardonnay. So the block at Seven Springs that Evening Land makes into their $125 bottle of La Source Chardonnay, that vineyard was actually planted all with 108, and I actually paid the people at Seven Springs to tear out 2.67 acres and plant Dijon clone Chardonnay, the stuff that was much better suited. And then when my 10-year contract was up, they leased that to Evening Lands and they started making the wine. And of course, that block was not only a great Chardonnay block, which is why I wanted to switch it over, but they were the right clones, and they've been able to make fabulous wine from that tiny little block of grapes. So, So what do you think? So Temperance Hill, very high altitude in the Eola Amity Hills. I don't think I can use my pointer, but if you look at the Eola Amity Hills and you see that little dimple coming in from the right side, that's essentially a tiny little valley that runs and faces primarily east. It's actually a very moderate valley, and Zenith, the picture you had of the big winery and stuff, that vineyard is actually at the deep in the dent of that, was basically where it ends. It's actually a little bowl. Above that, at a much higher elevation, running east and west, above that little dent, is Temperance Hill. Temperance Hill is actually the highest planted vineyard with grapes. There are Christmas trees that are higher, but it's the highest planted vineyard in the Eola half, which is the bottom half of the Eola Amity Hills. The Amity Hills is the little dimple at the very top. Right up there. And the ridge that I have is actually a hill that mostly faces east or west, has very little south-facing surface, and I have essentially the whole east-facing side. So not only do I have the highest block at that vineyard, but I have the coldest vines in the afternoon because it faces east. And in Oregon, somewhat different than where I grew up, the hottest part of the day is not in the early afternoon. The hottest part of the day is at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And then it starts to cool down, and it can cool extremely rapidly as it gets to 7 or 8 o'clock, because essentially the picture you had, there's essentially a pass into the Coast Range of mountains, which is exactly west of where that vineyard is in the Eola Amity Hills. And in the evening, cold wind off the Pacific Ocean blows through that pass, through essentially an open valley as it opens up from the pass and hits the side of the Eola Amity Hills, cooling it quite rapidly. But the vines that face the west side get a lot more heat and ripen faster than the vines that are facing east. And so you'd say, well, why do you want a high altitude vineyard that's cold? And I answer, well, it's a great food wine because it has better acidity, has lower alcohol. It has a beautiful balance. But it also has this sense that the Yosemite Hills has, which is a lot of that sweeter spice. So think ginger, cloves, nutmeg, allspice, those kind of things. In this particular part of Temperance Hill and in the area just of vineyards right around this little section, that spice takes on a smoky quality. So when you smell this wine, there's kind of a smoky sweetness to the spice. For a lot of people, they say one of two things. They say, oh, did you use whole clusters? Is that stems? And the answer is, no, I don't use any whole clusters. And they say, okay, so it must come from barrels that have been charred. And I'm like, nope, I use very little new wood in this wine, and I don't do anything past the medium toast for this. There's no charring, there's very little new wood in the wine. It is the place. It's volcanic soil, which brings out that cherry quality. I think it's more of a dark cherry, but there's a nice cherry quality to it. And for my money, when it comes to pairing with food, which is how I really think of wine, when you take a wine that has a really nice spice, kind of a smokiness, good acidity, kind of a balanced fruit component, kind of almost a juicy, zingy texture, that to me is a wine that matches really well with cooking over charcoal or cooking on a grill, because you get that kind of sweet, smoky quality that you infuse in the dishes that whatever you're cooking, whether it's bread or vegetables or mushrooms or proteins, on the grill. But the other thing about it is, for me, this is the wine of all of my wines that I think has a really nice sense of purity. I always say when you smell Temperance Hill and you taste Temperance Hill, you know what you got. It's clarity. It's like, oh, I get that. I know what those tastes are. I may not be able to describe them in words that everyone, knows about, but I can taste that, and I can taste the flavors, the balance of the juiciness that you're salivating from, that beautiful acidity, the smoky quality, the spices, the fruits, this kind of richness that slowly fades into the finish that kind of stays with you. And for me, when you have a wine that has a clarity, a beauty to it, the foods that you want to pair with it also are foods that have that same clarity. So you're not like braising things on your grill. You're taking a vegetable, a mushroom, a protein, maybe you're doing a seasoning on it, maybe you're doing a rub on it, maybe you're marinating it, but you're throwing it on that grill and you're presenting it on a plate in essence, in its simplicity. And that's one of the things that I think works really well with this wine, because it has, I don't want to say transparency, because there is clarity, but this is not a wimpy, transparent wine where there's not much going on. I think there's a lot of interesting things that are going on in the wine. I just don't know, I don't have the perfect word, but I hopefully you get kind of the idea. The opposite wine to this, in my hands, is Shea. The wines from Shea Vineyard are so complicated, so dimensional, and change so much over a period of, 10 minutes, a half hour, an hour, 2 hours, if you manage to slow yourself down and not just slam the bottle down because it tastes so good. Shea is extremely complicated and extremely dimensional. And what I would match Shea with, besides the fact that I'll just drink it because it tastes really good, but are dishes where, especially if you work all day in the kitchen and you've done a lot of things and you want this dish to really show its dimensions that you've worked hard to put into it, Shea is a beautiful wine for that, because it has so many little levels, little sideways, up and down, horizontal, depth, all three dimensions of taste levels within the wine, that if the dish has various levels, it helps to bring clarity to the dish. For me, when you say about what's a great food and wine pairing, I'd say it's a dish, and it could be something very simple. It's a dish where when you have the food element by itself, you get an idea of what's there. When you have a wine element by itself, you know what's there. But when you put them together, you taste things in the food that you didn't see before. And when you put the wine with the food, you find textures and flavors and nuances that you didn't see in the wine. And that for me is what a successful match is all about. So here you have some notes. Actually, in this wine, this is the vintage where we stopped using the pump house. So it basically is the east block, which is that big field, and then a little saddle. Essentially, the vineyard is formed like looking at a horse's saddle sideways. There's the place for your rear and the place for the horn, and there's this long kind of curved section through the middle. And the R block is that section in the middle, and basically the R block runs east and west with a hill on the east side and a hill on the west side, and it's somewhat protected. And there's only a very narrow strip that actually faces south on that saddle, the R block, and I have a third of that long narrow section that faces south. It's actually right above Bethel Heights, only a short distance from the famous southeast block, which to me is one of the greatest blocks of grapes in the entire Yale Amity Hills. So it's very nice to have that little piece. And then you have the saddle on either end.
Is Temperance Hill something that you own, or is this leased land?
So Temperance Hill was planted in 82, started producing in the late 80s. It's owned by a professor, actually a neuroscientist in San Diego. It's managed by Di Crisp, has no winery, never has had a winery. In the lovely review, and if you can look this up at your leisure, if you just Google 5 Great Oregon Vineyards, this article will come up where a publication picked the Willamette Valley as the wine region of the year. And then Paul Greggett, who's known Oregon longer than anybody, he literally knew David Lett when David Lett started, lives up in the Tri-Cities area of Washington, but he's come to Oregon, knows people, tasted the wines for more than 40 years. And he basically said, with more than 700 wineries, now there's 800 now, but with more than 700 wineries in Oregon, it's really hard to know where to start. But if you do what you do in Burgundy and say, well, if terroir is important, and if a great site is the first step in making great wine, and there's no question in my mind that is the first step, you can make really lousy wine from great grapes, but you can't make great wine from lousy grapes. It's easy to screw it up, but it's hard. It's essentially impossible if you don't have a really spectacular site to make a wine that is really special. And in Oregon, again, a lot of these vineyards that are really fabulous are very large, sell to a lot of different people. So the article basically picks these 5 Oregon vineyards and then talks about, Dick Chase sells to 21 different people, besides having his own winery that makes 5 or 5,500 cases of wine a year, but that's only 25% of what he's growing. And at the end of the article, it says the only person that makes wine from all of these vineyards is me. And in the case when that vineyard that came out, I'd been making wine from 4 of the vineyards for more than 22 years. And right now, this will be my 27th harvest from Shea, from Freedom Hill, from Temperance Hill, and my 15th harvest from Momtazi, because it didn't exist that long before. And the only one of those that I don't use is the one that I used to own part of, the Zenith.
It's August 23rd today, the day we're doing this Zoom. At what point are you thinking of harvesting this year? Or do you have a date kind of selected? Is it coming soon?
No, thank God. I was just out. I'm trying to put a lot more content on the website. Mm-hmm. So I've been doing a lot of shooting of information about each wine and tasting notes. Also, I've been doing some philosophy things, especially with this Mimi Castile that helped me figure out to buy this place. We shot a whole thing on the kind of sustainable, kind of almost radical kinds of farming that we're doing. So here, because we're basically doing a very integrated approach to agriculture, which is not the way most vineyards look or are managed. And so we're coming up with video content to so you can actually hear about this. But so I've been out in all the vineyards in the last week, and the older block of Shea is about mid Veraison, was probably getting closer to 80% Veraison now. The terrace block, which is very steep and a little bit younger than the block 6 that I use, was only about 20% into Veraison. I was at Mumtazi, and we were about halfway through Veraison in 3 of the blocks, but only about 10% in Veraison in one of the block where the 777 and 667 clones come together. There's me cooking some of the food we offer here, because if I say food is good, I actually want you to be able to come here and taste it. So unlike wineries that have kitchens with chefs and people like that, my wife and I have created all the food. She's primarily the one in the kitchen and comes up with the ideas, and then we develop the recipes and the food pairings together. So you can come here almost any point. So let's see. There is Veraison. The La Crema is kind of what Block 6 looks like. And the Land Vine Wine is kind of what the 667 and 777 Mumtazi looks like right now.
And usually this takes place in August, or is it running a little late?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question. So, you know, what used to be normal isn't normal anymore.
Right.
Because it's getting warmer.
Yeah.
But it's not just getting warmer, it's getting weirder. So we're having more variation from season to season, and that makes it that much more difficult to try to figure out, well, how should I manage this, given that you don't really know what's going to happen in any particular vintage. So I would say that right now we're on a pretty normal, maybe 4 days early season, which normally in Oregon in the old days, we would pick Pinot Noir at the beginning of October. Pick sparkling wine somewhere around the 15th to the 20th of September, and Chardonnay at the beginning of Pinot Noir into the first 4 or 5 days of Pinot Noir. But we've had vintages where everything ripened at once. We picked the whole vintage in 6 days, which was kind of crazy. And then we've had vintages where it got cool in the middle and we picked over 3 weeks. This year, it's pretty clear from the differences in the different blocks that because it rained during bloom, that if it was the rain, things that bloomed went through set fruit, but then the rain stalled everything because it was cool and wet, and the vines were just kind of waiting for the sun to come back out. And then the sun came out, and then that part went through bloom. So we're gonna have more variation in each block, each clone, depending on, you know, what it's gonna be picked. I mean, I've picked all of Mumtazi in 1 day, and I've picked Mumtazi over 10 days. And I would say it's probably, the way it looks this year, is it's probably gonna be more like at least over a week that we'll pick the different parcels depending on when they get the right ripeness. And for me, ripeness is all about your mouth. It's not about numbers. It's about what it tastes like and how it feels and how the canopy looks and how the seeds are coloring up and what the skins taste like when you chew just the skin itself and the little bit of the color of the seed. But I have very, very gentle processing, so I don't bust up any seeds. So I don't really want to chew up seeds because that's not going to happen. So if I chew up a seed and say, oh, the seed tastes really good, well, who cares? I'm not breaking up seeds in my wine. So so I would say that the very end of September, we'll be definitely picking some Pinot Noir, and we'll move on from there, you know.
I was looking for a picture of a vineyard like you see at the top here. And if you had a variation in a vineyard where you have a hillside, you know, the top of the hill probably is ripening before the bottom of the hill, and the middle of the hill is somewhere in between. And so what he was describing is picking by, you know, specific spot or parcel or block, and a lot of land is kind of separated by some of the physical attributes of the vineyard, whether it's the slope or some sort of a physical drainage or creek or madrone or whatever you want to call it in between each vineyard parcel. And my family, we make Zinfandel, and it's always nice when you can go into the vineyard and pick it all at once from a labor standpoint, but it's also kind of nice to be able to have it ripen homogeneously, and that's what you're looking for, is to have things kind of ripen to that perfect spot where you can pick it. When it's spotty, you maybe aren't able to dial it in as perfectly as you want, and if you're lucky you can, but it's sometimes a little bit of luck is involved, making sure that you're in the vineyard at the right time at the right moment. But that's one of the challenges of growing grapes in 2000 and in the 2000s and going forward is playing with all these variables that Mother Nature is handing us, and depending on where you are in the world. Here in California, we're having all kinds of issues with fires. Do you have issues with fires up in Oregon yet? Or I shouldn't say yet, but do you have any issues with fire?
Yeah, there's fires in the South Cascades, essentially closer to where California is. There's sometimes fires around Mount Hood. We are separated enough. So essentially the Willamette Valley works its way up into the Cascade Mountains. But if you see it in the map you just had up, essentially all of these vineyards are on the opposite side of the valley. So the valley running down the middle is very flat. The Willamette River runs, basically winds down the middle of the valley. Everything that we're talking about is all on the west side of that river. The river is almost a thermal barrier. So if you think about when you're going to the ocean or going to a large body of water, it's you have a certain temperature in the inland, and then as you get close to the ocean, the temperature just changes by the ocean. That's essentially the thermal mass of the water, but it's also essentially a kind of barrier. So when it's burning on the east side, it's not as easy unless a reverse wind comes. Most of our wind comes off of the ocean either from the north or from the west. It's much more unusual to get winds coming from the Washington Desert, but if that happens, then that would bring the smoke and blow it essentially over the river. But that's not really a dominant pathway, and we've been very blessed that we've not had any significant smoke issues in the Willamette Valley that I know of ever. So thank God. I shouldn't say that. I need to knock on some wood. Here's a pallet here. Beat on that thing.
One of the things we always talk about when we talk about the Oregon Willamette Valley is that this is strange anomaly that the ocean floor is actually moving towards the coast and increasing the elevation and changing, basically the Willamette Valley on a continuous basis. Is that something you've had run-ins with? Have you seen or felt, or as 30 years in the business, it's probably moved up a couple feet?
No, maybe a couple millimeters. It's really a slow process.
That's slow.
Even Mount St. Helens, which blew a month and a half 2 months after I moved to Oregon in 1980, is, that's 40 years now. And it's, even with the magma pushing in the center of that dome, it's only come up about 350 feet. And that's really an active, continuing to be active kind of volcanic activity. So we're not seeing anything very dramatic here. Okay. What is happening is that plate that we're sitting on essentially has its junction about 50 or 60 miles out in the ocean. And you have your San Andreas Fault that you can see, and you know that thing is there looming in someone's future, hopefully not any of yours. We have a similar thing out in the ocean, which they say could easily give us, a level 9 on the Richter scale or more earthquake, which would unfortunately trigger a very large tidal wave, and we're only 50 or 60 miles. So the notice for that hitting from the seismic activity is vanishingly short for people on the coast. So I love the coast, and I always know how to drive to get away from it as quickly as possible up a hill, because it is, they say it will happen in the next 100 years, that we will have some major activity off the coast from that tectonic plate. But let's talk about something more fun. So I've just poured myself some Momtazi. Momtazi is actually, I guess talking about volcanoes makes some kind of sense. This is a vineyard in the McMinnville appellation. So when you were looking at the map, the McMinnville appellation, you can see this area where the darker, more intensely colored moves to the west into the Coast Range. That essentially, if you continue that piece, is where the pass to the ocean is, called the Van Duzer Corridor. And Van Duzer Corridor is now something very famous in Oregon, or at least people know about the effect of the Van Duzer Corridor, which is that in a coast range of mountains, it's about 20 miles wide and about 2,000 to 3,000 feet high. It's not a gigantic set of mountains, but the Van Duzer Corridor is only 800 feet wide, and the area where the Van Duzer Corridor is only about 10 miles wide. So the winds coming off the Pacific Ocean, as the valley starts to cool down and the air mass starts to collapse, something has to come in, and it essentially comes in off the Pacific through that corridor. Well, you can see McMinnville is closer to that mouth, and Momtazi is essentially, I actually can see where it is, but if you would look at the McMinnville dots on your map and carry the dots down, you'll see a mountain straight right there. That's actually Momtazi, and if you look, there is kind of a northeast, southwest, darker area, which is the valley. And the hill that to the south of that valley is part of Momtazi, but is much smaller. The hill just to the north of that is where these grapes come from, and they all come from the highest part of the hill. Hence the theme that I look for places that are a little bit extreme, because if the place is a little more extreme, you're more likely to have a stronger signature of that place than grapes growing in a valley or, on a low hillside or sheltered. And from that particular part of Momtazi, you can actually see the whole Eola Amity Hills, and a bit beyond it, you can see the Cascade Mountains, if the weather's clear enough, because the mountains are, 50 miles away. So this is almost as high as Temperance Hill, but that hill is essentially a dome, kind of elongated northeast, southwest. And essentially what happens at the top of the dome is that you have extremely long hours of light. So unlike Temperance, where I'm only on the east side, in this case, I'm on the top. And some of the vineyards face slightly southwest, some of them face slightly southeast. But essentially, from this vineyard, you see the first sun coming over the Cascade Mountains. You're in full sun, no trees, no other hills, nothing else, until the last sun goes over the Coast Range. So you have very long hours. And just like if I put you out for 4 or 5 weeks, which is the grapes after Varese, when they actually are creating color, I put you out in the sun for a very long period of time, you're going to react to that sun. One of the things you're going to do is try to protect yourself by making pigment. And what essentially happens in Pinot Noir is it does try to make pigment, because if there's more sun and more heat, the grape is trying to protect itself from dehydrating and being unable to ripen. The other major stressor is wind. And because, again, you're on top of a dome, when the wind stops blowing through that Van Duzer corridor and hits that top of the hill, which is extremely exposed, that is another stressor. So the skin of grapes even gets thicker and denser, and you have more extractives. So what you really have in Momtazi is everything that would make for power, for tannin, for color, for pigment, for richness. You add to that the effect of wind on flavor. And the wind effect in terms of flavor is that it brings out spice. So the Eola-Amity Hills of all the little regions in Oregon is known as the place where the wines have more of that sweeter brown spice quality. Momtazi takes that level of wind and ratchets it up a couple notches. And what I find in Momtazi is rather than the spice being as sweet, it becomes more of a savory spice. Think of the kind of spices you use in the Near East or the Far East. So cumin, coriander, especially turmeric, white pepper, these very pungent aromatic spices. And in various vintages at various ages, these things show up in Momtazi, much more than cloves or cinnamon or ginger, but these more pungent spices. And that essentially is the effect of that very powerful wind blowing by. The other thing that happens with Momtazi is that it's also on some really lousy soil that's pretty thin in places. So the vine is really struggling. And at Momtazi, the clusters historically are about half the size as they are in any other place. And the berries are smaller than any other place. So essentially, when we talk about juice to skin ratio and all these things that people, think are super important, it really is just an attribute. It's something that is what Mother Nature gives you from growing this grape in this particular place. And then you say, okay, this is what I get. I don't get to change the skin to juice ratio. And I don't really want to change it, because if it's very high like Momtazi, it's going to make a wine that's going to show that as part of its sense of place. If the clusters are bigger and the berries are a little bit bigger, it doesn't mean I'm going to make a wimpy wine. It's just going to be a little bit of a notch down in terms of that tannin color power will be balanced by other flavor, other dimensions, maybe a little better acidity, maybe less intensity on the palate, maybe a wine that's so much better with, say, grilled salmon than it might be with roast beef, something that would be great with a vegetable lasagna as opposed to a hunk of cow, or something else. And I'm one of these winemakers that actually doesn't say you need a big piece of protein to make these wines taste good. There's a lot of things we do in the kitchen that make these wines taste beautiful that have nothing to do with big hunks of protein. And I encourage you to not think of wine in terms of, oh, well, I'm eating beef, so I need to drink this. We had a person here from your area, a sommelier at a restaurant in Orange County, and she was like, I'd always had duck with red wine, and you came and did a dinner and matched duck with Chardonnay. And I never thought of that duck could be good with Chardonnay. And you just changed my world, because it was great with Chardonnay, but it's my Chardonnay. It's not, if you thought of what Chardonnay is supposed to be from your spectrum of Chardonnays that you've tasted, and statistically, we drink more Chardonnay than anything else. So we all have this idea of what it is. And I said, and I do this, so I say, okay, think of what Chardonnay is going to be like. Here's my glass. Taste it. Is that what you expected? And everyone says, no, it doesn't taste like that. But it's Chardonnay, almost at its pure essence, but grown on a very Chablis-like soil and made in very much like an old school Chablis, where oak and stirring leaves and sweetness and overripeness isn't part. It's about Chardonnay growing in really poor conditions, but able to get fully ripened, but textured in depth. So, these things, these food matches to me are really interesting. So when I think about, well, what am I going to have with Momtazi? The other part about this is put this in your mouth and leave it in your mouth for a while, and then swallow it and think about what's happening in your mouth. One of the things that's really important to me, and I think for most people is the most important, is how does the wine feel? We're really good at writing all these descriptors. canapés, cinnamon, raspberries, blackberries, cigars, saddle leather, toasted wood, cedar. So, and we think that those are really important. We use those to describe it. But when is the last time any of you went to a wine shop and said, oh, I'm interested in a wine with some cedar and some black cherry, but don't want any Panapis, man. Forget that nonsense. I mean, we don't use these words. The reason we like a wine is not because it has a specific profile that someone can identify because we've trained their palate in a sensory lab with standards. It's like, who cares? We buy wine because we like the way it feels. And to me, this is the wine that has the most kind of umami, the texture. What is umami? It's what you get when you take demi-glaze and add it to anything. It's what mushrooms adds to its dish. It's this sense of texture. And when I drink Mumtazi, I feel it in my lower jaw. I feel in my lower cheeks. This thing stays around. And so when I'm thinking about Mumtazi, I'm thinking, well, what are the foods that are about texture? What things? When is the season that I want that? And to me, I always go to fall and winter, because in the summer, the last thing I want is, pot roast. But after all summer, where you don't want any more pot roast, you want all those fresh things you can grill and those beautiful vegetables. And then the end of the summer comes, and instead of saying, oh, I'm so sad that I can't get a ramp, my green beans are all, now coming out of a can or frozen from another country, you think, oh, I want pot roast. I want braised ribs. For me, I want cassoulet. And these are all dishes that are all about that texture, that richness. Sausages. I mean, when do the hunters go out and hunt? Get game in the fall. So all of these things naturally show up. And these are all dishes with a lot of umami and a lot of texture. So for me, Mumtazi is really the wine of the fall and early winter. And Temperance Hill is always the wine of summer. And I just think about it that way. I just think, well, so I drink Mumtazi in the summer. If I'm eating something, if I've got some really beautiful mushrooms, if I went out in the spring and got some morels and I'm going to make a risotto, I'm going to drink Mumtazi. But if I'm cooking something on the grill, and I love to cook like yellow and green squash on the grill and just marinate them in some olive oil and salt and pepper and some little vinegar thing and let them sit for a while and then throw them on the grill and just get them browned up. And I mean, with Italian kind of a bread thing where you just take a good piece of bread and you paint a little olive oil on it and you take a clove of garlic and smash it and kind of open it up and rub that over, and then take a tomato and just cut it in half and rub the juicy side of the tomato on and put it on the grill and grill it. Just try that with Temperance Hill. You don't need anything fancy. This is just flavor dimensions that just show up and are just, I mean, it's good. It's hedonistic. It's like, what's wrong with having some fun, especially in the time of COVID? Like, we're not all having a lot of fun right now. I mean, I'm looking at harvest with masks and, social distancing and trying to figure out how we're going to sort fruit and can't bring anybody in. And we got, we can't have interns showing up. We're kind of locking ourselves down for 5 weeks while we do this, because it's real. It's an issue. What if one of us gets sick? I mean, all of a sudden, it's like, how do you deal with a production when you have it's not like a brewer. I can just shut down, not make any beer for, 2 weeks. Like, if the grapes are ripe and I can't pick them. So when I can eat something really nice and have a nice glass of wine that makes it taste good, to me, that's comforting. That's what this is all really about.
You're doing a good job of making me really hungry. And, I love the description, summer wine and fall wine. I've not had a winery ever mention it like that, but I love the weight of this Mumtazi kind of paralleling with that, the gaminess of the fall feast, and that seems right to me.
It's yeah. I mean, and do I have a winter wine? Well, actually I do. And it's Freedom Hill, because And by the time we're getting into the winter, I'm getting kind of tired of winter. Like when we get into, March and it's still snowing up in the mountains and it's still raining, and I haven't seen the sun for 3 weeks and I'm getting a little depressed. This is the time of the year when I actually want that piece of, that nice piece of juicy meat. I just want something that's very comforting and warm and lovely, and Freedom Hill, but it also has that juiciness. It's like, it's not just something that's big and powerful, but there is that center juiciness, like in leg of lamb or a lamb chop or a porterhouse or something. You get that beautiful sense of what's inside playing against what's on the outside. And from there's my new place.
Is that where you're talking to us from right now?
Yeah, you know where that little red thing is? I'm sitting almost right where that red thing is.
Wow, that's like a temple for Pinot Noir. Look at that.
It is my temple of Pinot. You're right. I love it.
Are you using the wood uprights for fermentations, or is that something else for holding?
Yeah, it was another. I didn't have any money for the first 10 years I was making wine, but at the 10-year mark, I went to France and in Italy and hung out for a long time, 5 weeks, and visited wineries. And I walked into Comte d'Armand, Benjamin's winemaker, and I walked into his winery and we were going to do this tasting, and I walked into this little room, and there was this wooden fermenter, a wooden tank, kind of like a little bit smaller than one in the black with the black stripes. And I said, "What's this? Never saw one of these." And he was like, "Oh, that's an old French oak fermenter." And I was like, "Really? What do you use it for?" And he says, "Probably the best lot of grapes I get in any particular year." And I was like, "Oh, really?" And then I had the chance to go to DRC, Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, and I walked in their cellar, and I was like, "So where's all those concrete tanks that everybody in France has? And where's this?" I knew there wasn't going to be many stainless steel tanks, because frankly, the wineries are too old in France to get a stainless steel tank inside of the buildings. So concrete was actually really useful, because you could just form up a wall and pour concrete around it, and you could turn it into a fermentation tank without having to put anything in it. But I walked into the Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, and there was only wood tanks like this. That was it, 100%. And I thought, well, that's good enough for Domaine de la Romanée-Conti. Maybe I ought to try this thing. So I actually bought the black one and the next one to it, the one that's in the middle, back in 2001. And because I had a science, part of me was in a science background, I said, well, I'm going to see if it really makes a difference. And we basically had stainless steel tanks that were the same volume, and took vineyards for 3 years and divided them bin by bin, picked the vineyard, divided it bin by bin into a wood one, into a stainless steel one, treated exactly the same, pressed it the same day, put it in the same kinds of barrels and the same coopers, and then would have people come in. We do it ourselves, but we were biased, So other people come in and just taste blind out of the barrel, same kind of barrel, same age, same everything, and say, well, which one do you like? And the barrels weren't marked. And they would, and like 100% of the time, they said, I like the one in the wood from, that one, and that would be the one from the wooden fermenter. And so I bought more. I was like, this works. There are some things it doesn't work for. It doesn't work for Freedom Hill. Freedom Hill tends to be very powerful and extracts tannins, and the wood fermenter tends to be slightly warmer. And for Freedom Hill, it's just too much. So we don't put Freedom Hill in it, but these wines that you're tasting were probably either the majority or all fermented in wooden tanks like that. So.
I got to take a group to Burgundy a few years back and hang out with Benjamin Leroux, and we did Comte d'Armand, and we went to see his kind of newer brand of his own invention as well. So I'm a fan of his as well. Influential dude. Glad to see a couple of that connection to that story there. And it looks like you're able to entertain there at the facility. Are you open for visits?
We are. We got shut down. The state of Oregon closed everything down for 7 weeks, or some wineries for 5.5 weeks. But if we were in an area that was closer to a more of a hot spot. So we were closed for 7 weeks, and then we opened. Luckily, we have a big hillside and chairs and a deck, and we bought a bunch of big picnic tables, like heavy duty park kind of picnic tables, and spread them out around the vineyard. And we do a lot of, we were able to expand outside. And then we'd always done a lot of food things. And when we opened, we knew we were going to offer food because that's kind of who we are. And we went from pre-COVID, from about 15% of people buying a bistro board or a thing we call the sip and savor, which is 5 wines matched with 4 different foods, little bites of things. We call it playing with your food. It's again, not much pretense here. It's like, here, play with your food. Try these wines. You get all the wines. Here's the food. See what you like. We think that their parallel ones are kind of interesting, but you may have a different choice. We're not all wired the same. There's no wrong way to do this. So we went from 15% in the first day we opened, which was the Friday before Memorial Weekend, and 90% of the people had something to eat. And that's basically continued. And in the summer, we're coming up to our last weekend, but we have a happy hour on Friday. And it's outside on one of the lawns with furniture scattered all over the place. And we have a featured Pinot Noir and a featured white wine. And then we do 4 dishes that are matched with that wine. And so it's basically specials, and they're $7 each. And you get a bottle of wine, you get it at a discount, and you just order whatever you want. For food, there's always crostini, there's always some kind of a protein, there's always a dessert, and let's see, then there's always a salad, some kind of a salad. And people just come and have a good time, hang out for a couple hours on Friday. So yeah, the food thing has become really big.
How many of you have been to Oregon to see what's happening up there? Any of you? It's not the first place that you think to visit as a wine destination, but actually Portland works out pretty well as a hub to receive you. And of course, we've got Southwest flying there, and so that makes it very convenient. But it's about 30 to 40 minutes outside of Portland, maybe a little longer depending on how far you're going. And it's kind of set up pretty nicely. Of course, this is in a different moment, and when we're all feeling a little more comfortable, and it's probably a little calmer in Portland. Hopefully that's all calming down now. But there will be a day when it's ripe to get back there. And I'm going to recommend Oregon for a visit for you guys. It's really a fun journey, and tying in Portland is always a culture too. But you said there's close to 900 wineries now?
Yeah, 800 now, yeah.
That's amazing.
And California makes about 70% of the wine in the U.S. We make 1%. Washington is 3 times as big as Oregon. There's actually more wine made in New York and Pennsylvania than there is in Oregon.
Wow.
We're not very big, but we do the Pinot Noir and other things pretty well, we think. And that's why Oregon as a place, because it turns out it's a really good place to do this. And it isn't that we're all geniuses and that we figured it all out, because remember, it's been less than 50 years since the first Pinot Noir in Oregon released. 48 right now. We haven't had a long history like many other regions. We didn't have any wine back then, and yet it's wonderful. And the other part about Oregon, which when people come, they gravitate towards, especially people in the profession, is that we do a lot of things collaboratively for the trade or for consumers. International Pinot Noir Celebration, Oregon Pinot Camp. And people come and look at us, 50 plus people, and they say, why aren't you competitors? Like, why aren't you all fighting with each other? And we're like, yeah, because if we fought with each other, we'd have nothing. I mean, we're the underdogs here. We're a little bitty region that makes a very small wine amount of wine that's from a very difficult grape. So if we didn't all work together, we couldn't really survive the way we are. And we like each other. So, when you come here and visit, and hopefully you will, you'll find that, I think, all the way through the industry, that we actually like each other. You'll say, where else should you go? And we'll give you a whole list of places that we think you ought to go visit, and places to eat, because we all like to eat too. Pinot Noir is a great food wine. So that's kind of our story.
Well, Ian, if I could suggest something, it sounds like the 50-year anniversary is coming up. Maybe you could lead a tour up there for us all.
That sounds like a good idea.
I like that.
COVID will be over. I mean, this is all going to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We'll cook for you. We'll cook some really good stuff. You can go look and see.
Mark, allow me to share one thing. I know you'll like this. I changed my shirt just for you.
Oh, yes! Badgers go!
You got it. Yeah, UW, Wisconsin, Madison, 1983, mechanical engineer.
Yeah, I graduated in 74 in
Cool.
theater as a theatrical designer. That was my original career.
Wow.
So
That's why you're having more fun than me.
the other thing the last thing I'll just throw out there, I know we're kind of running over a lot, or probably into a time frame, but is that there is also a real reverence for the land here. It's part of why we had the first bottle recycling bill in the United States. It turns out that if you look at Oregon, more than 50% of our trash is actually recycled in one way or another. Even with the Chinese not taking our plastic, we're still over 50%. And the wine industry is really founded on sustainability. The first internationally certified sustainable program in the United States came out of Oregon, called the LIVE program. All of our vineyards are sustainably farmed in some way. Temperance Hill is organically certified fruit. Freedom Hill is sustainably certified, now in their second year of working towards an organic certification. Momtazi is biodynamically certified. Shea is a Department of Natural Resource watershed protection certified. We're at this point organic because our vineyard is very young. We just planted in the winter of 2018. So we just have, little things that are basically, if they're 3 feet high, we're good. And if they're 5 feet high, we're ecstatic. And if they're a foot high, we're saying, well, it'll get there, but will probably be some version of that, organic, biodynamic. We care about the land. I'm a big believer that part of terroir is the interaction with what's growing on your plants, with what's growing deep in the soil anaerobically, and that the ability of you to taste what's going on in that land is critically associated with the life of the things that don't have photosynthetic apparatus, that essentially is a cooperative relationship. There's an interesting podcast, Radio Lab, that talked about this and basically said, if there wasn't this interaction between mycorrhizal fungi deep in the soil and the aerobic things that are growing and making food and trading nutrients and things, a oak tree would never get bigger than a bush. That is required to happen. And one of the things that revolutionized Burgundy was the movement back to biodynamics. And probably the most important part of that was not things that they were spraying above the ground. It was actually the things that they stopped spraying above the ground, and essentially the microflora they were adding into the soil with the 500 preparation, bringing the life back and having this more potent interaction between the grapevine and what was down, creating that terroir. And this whole discussion that Mimi and I have about this will hopefully be available, within 3 or 4 weeks, and you can listen to us going kind of crazy about mycorrhizal fungi and the interaction of terroir and respecting the land in its depth, not just, I got this kind of rock and you don't, so mine's better. It's more about, I want my land to be alive. So the idea that you would make it look like a Minnesota cornfield with a monoculture of grapes and nothing else growing is, to me, the opposite of what really sustainable practices are that you use to create a sense of place. So our young vineyard doesn't look like a Minnesota cornfield. It's got all kinds of stuff growing all around it and in it. And we didn't take out the oak trees in the middle of the vineyard. We didn't take out the ravines and gut them. We left Mother Nature all around every single parcel that's here. Feel like we want to be a partner with nature, not the dominator.
And the decision to be biodynamic in that site, was it because you had such a controllable ecosystem there, or is, maybe there isn't anybody neighboring, or what, did it just make sense, or is that something you wanted to experiment with? What was the
Well, I mean, at Momtazi?
Yeah.
Well, Momtazi, again, didn't have a winery until they got a huge production, didn't have anything, couldn't sell all the fruit, so they started a winery, So they still, again, sell the vast majority of their fruit. But it turned out that Jimmy Brooks, who was the founder of Brooks Winery, was also someone that was working at Willackenzie and was very interested in biodynamics. And Momtazi essentially hired Jimmy to help him figure out how to plant it. And Mo had come from the Middle East, and his mother was a very strong proponent of kind of herbal medicines that you find in nature, that you take to heal all parts of your body. So this was something that he had grown up with from his family. And so when Jimmy said, I think we should do this using these things, Mo was like, I believe, let's do it. And one of the things that Mo, again, I didn't realize that Mo hadn't had a vineyard for a long time. He came to me what I thought was, kind of in the middle of my career, and said, I'd really love to sell you some fruit. Would you like some fruit? And after a couple of years, I said, yeah, I believe in this biodynamic principles. I believe in what you're doing. My feeling from visiting Alsace and Champagne and Burgundy is that what happens in biodynamics is you get a much more clarity with the terroir of both the site, the ecosystem, and also you taste the nuances of the wine more clearly when it's grown biodynamically. And at that point, there weren't a lot of biodynamic options in Oregon. A number of the people that are biodynamic now weren't biodynamic at that point. So I said to Mo, yeah, I want to get some fruit. And in 2006, I started making wine. I didn't really understand that the vineyard was only planted in 99 through 2001, the parts that I have, and that I was actually getting like the second or third crop. The first vintage in 2006, because again, we talked about the thin soil and the more severe things, the more severe conditions. The first crop that I got from what was 7-year-old plants was 0.6 tons per acre, which is like nothing. I mean, it's like, are you kidding me? And I made the wine, and knowing that this was a vineyard that produced very powerful things. So I was very careful about making it, took it out in the market, went to New York and said, I only have 20 cases for all of New York. I'd made a mistake a few years before of selling an entire really great vintage to one person. And I was like, I'm not doing that. So I went out with a sales team and started visiting the accounts. And I said, I've got 20 cases. I'm not going to sell more than 2 cases to anybody, no matter what they offer me. I'm not doing it. And after 10 accounts, I was sold out because every single person that tasted the wine said, I've never tasted anything like this from Oregon. This is incredible. I want my 2 cases. And that's kind of the reputation that Momtazi has gotten, especially in my hands, is that it's a very unique experience. It's not something that you can, wines out of the Dundee Hills, you can probably have 4 or 5 wineries and it'll be a similar experience. But Momtazi is so unusual. And there's so few wineries and vineyards in this appellation that when you taste it, you're like, oh, if I want that again, I don't have a lot of choices. That's okay with me. I love to make it, and I'm going to keep doing it because I think it's a really unique sense of place.
Cool. What's next for you in your journey? You've obviously gone through a lot, and we're going through a lot. Maybe you're not even looking, except for trying to return to normalcy. But you just got a new facility. You've been moving around in your relationship there with the ownership. Are you have you achieved what you wanted to do there with ownership of land and winery and all that stuff?
The short answer is yes. It always makes me a little bit uncomfortable because I've had a chance to interact with a lot of winemakers, and one of the things after 32 years is that I think that if anybody says that they figured it out and that they know how to make wine and they got all the questions solved, they should stop making wine. Humility and being extremely open to what's happening in a place in a particular year. Vine age, as vines get older, they make different wines. And anybody that stops being humble and just starts saying, oh, I got a recipe, this is what I do, and then has this big crew do it, that's not some wine that I'm interested in drinking anymore. So one of the things that I did when I left Zenith and that vineyard was I downsized. I dropped 40% of my production. I dropped 3 of 7 vineyards, just went back to the 4 and said, you know what, I'm going to do what I do really well. I've always wanted to grow grapes. The reason I went to Zenith was because I thought I could grow grapes or I'd have some hand in, because the vineyard was dying of fox or needed to be replanted. The reality was that it sold to 11 different wineries, that there was a crew of 10 people and a crew chief. And I wasn't doing it. And one of the things that I realized as I got older was I really wanted to actually grow my own grapes. I wanted to drive the tractor. I wanted to plant the plant. I wanted to pound the post in. I wanted to prune it. I wanted to do that myself. And by coming here and reducing all the other distractions down to a much simpler kind of lifestyle, I actually created the space to do that. I also started making sparkling wine again, which I did for 13 years and then quit for almost a decade. And now since 2016, I'm making actually 3 different sparkling wines each year. We released the first one this spring. It's a very small release, so you had to be a wine club member to get a bottle. But next spring, there'll actually be 3 different wines. A Pinot Blanc, more traditional Cremant d'Alsace style, but longer aging, more like a champagne that was made from Pinot Blanc. A rosé, which is actually Pinot Blanc and Pinot Noir, because we tried Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. We didn't like it as much as Pinot Blanc. So we said, we like this, we're gonna make it. So we did that. And then a Brut, which is the longest aging on the lees, that is now beginning this last harvest, a single vineyard, actually the very top of Temperance Hill in the coldest spot of all. We planted Chardonnay to essentially make a Blanc de Blanc, and that vineyard came into production. On the thinner soil at the very top of that slope, we actually planted Riesling, because I love Mosel Riesling. And I decided I was going to actually finally make some, but only from this particular spot where I thought I could actually have a chance of making that style of Riesling, which meant I don't want a Riesling with 12.5 or 13% alcohol. I want a Riesling, hopefully, that's around 10% alcohol, and that isn't particularly sweet, what I would call a Cabinet Halbtrocken style. So less than 1% sugar, picked early, really fabulous acidity, very low pH in the wine. A wine that you can age for decades if you want. I'm going to drink it. I only made 400 bottles last year, and I'm going to drink a significant part of it myself.
Got to have goals.
Yeah, that's got to have goals. So, I'm bringing back things that I did before and something that I always wanted to do. And I'm driving the tractor and pruning vines, and, as they grow up, attaching them to the wire and to the trellis, and having a really good time.
Going forward, we'll have this Zoom on the page for people to watch going forward as well. And we'll look forward to revisiting with you again.
Thank you.